You are listening to Leverage, the podcast about power, politics, and influence. I'm Kristal Taylor.
And I'm Breon Wells. We have yet a second Supreme Court decision to unpack. And here is the Super Bowl of unpacking in this particular episode. And Twin, you know, given that it touches on women's rights, you know, access to women's health, women's right to choose, maybe I'll introduce it and then let you take first, because you know it's only fair for women to be able to speak and unpack this from this stance. But we had, of course, you all know, Roe v. Wade has been a constitutional right that has been outlined, the right to have an abortion, to right to choose, for a woman to be able to choose her reproductive rights. It's been seen really as a right to privacy, right? Under a right to privacy, for a woman not to have to put out all her business to everybody else and say, hey, society, let's group think in the decision way about my particular body, right? That has been at least a known in verbiage staple. We even had Supreme Court justices that have continued, or those that were being nominated, sit through these Senate confirmation hearings. And when they got the question, they said, Roe v. Wade is a constitutional right, blah, blah, blah. I will not touch it.
Well ensconced in the rule of law.
That's right. And then, you know, it's funny how once you get the job, all bets are off. Once you get the job. And so unfortunately, there was leaked a few weeks ago, feels like an eternity actually, Twin, but a few weeks ago, there was a draft that was leaked about, you know, the fact that Roe v. Wade might be overturned. And if one was going to overturn it, this is how they would do it. And the arguments thereof. It was almost like, what was that O.J. Simpson book that I didn't do it, but had I done it, here's how I would have. It was one of those sorts of scenarios for those that—
if the glove don't fit, you must acquit.
But, you know, we went down this path, and lo and behold, on yesterday, this is hot off the press, y'all.
Yesterday, what was it? Friday, June 24th,
2022, the Supreme Court ruled in a 6-3 way that actually, oops, we made a mistake. Courts got it wrong in the past. You know, that thing we call the constitutional right actually isn't as much.
For 50 years, by the way. We have acknowledged it as a constitutional right for 50 years.
And I'm going to allow you to unpack this, Twin, later. But even cited Plessy versus Ferguson to say there was a time where, you know, we had a disfavorable view of Black people. And then we decided to turn it over with Brown v. Board of Education. So this is the same stance. This is like that, you know, we happen to run back. And so although it should be noted that in that Brown v. Board of Education, they were not taking away a right that they had added before, because Black people weren't even considered. You know, there was that pesky thing, like how y'all look at Black people.
You know that pesky thing where like all of the founders, the founders, our founding fathers, the signatories of the Constitution that declared that all men shall be created equal. Oh, those people, all of whom were slaveholders.
Those folks.
All of whom were slaveholders, and who were like, oh, but when we say all men are created equal, what we really mean are white land-owning men, white men with property. We ain't talking about women. We definitely ain't talking about our slaves, because y'all ain't people. Y'all are.
We ain't talking about the indigenous folks. We ain't talking about the indigenous folks. That's right.
We ain't talking about none of y'all.
So it's funny, because in this case, this is a case where they did introduce a right, enumerated constitutionally, and now they've taken it back. So Twin, unpack for us the politics of in Mississippi.
I won't even pretend that I can unpack all the politics. This is going to sound very reductionist, right? Because at root, what's being protected here, and this is going to be controversial, twin. This is going to be controversial.
I got my controversial cup.
Well, here, let's before we talk about at root what's being protected, let's tee up an interesting concept, and that is, in the broader landscape, in these Americas, one of the fascinating dynamics that is currently at play is that people of color, both through birth and immigration, are becoming the majority in this country. At the same time, for the first time in history, white people have a higher mortality rate, and at the same time, they're not having babies the way that they used to. So the white population is actually shrinking.
Oh, is it?
Right. So when people really want to get down to the brass tacks about, so how is this question about women's right to choose and women's bodies, how is it so easily hijacked, not only now by the Supreme Court, right, but by state legislators? Why is it that all of these other people, most of whom are white men, because that unfortunately is what the composition of most state legislatures are still like, right? So you still have, what is it, like 90% overall across the country? We're seeing growth, we're seeing improvement, but still, most state legislative seats are held by white men, which isn't inherently bad in and of itself. It just gives you a lens into perhaps some factors that might be going into like the political landscape behind all of these things, right? So,
I mean, twin, slightly. I don't disagree with you, but on the sense of, is that inherently a bad thing? One might question if the driver has been driving us to hell for the last 20 centuries, might it be the problem? Might the driver be the problem?
Might the driver be the problem? We shall leave that to listeners to decide for themselves.
Correct.
They decide for themselves.
Go ahead.
No. Listen, you had to get it off the chest, but the reality is that context is important to understanding how we even get to a place like a situation with Dobbs, right? Because it's not just that Roe v. Wade was overturned. It's not just the woman's right to choose. It goes back to these questions of power, right? And who has power, who has agency, and who is allowed to make decisions about what is best for themselves, right? That's really what's at root here. Because as a practical effect, yes, Dobbs overturned Roe v. Wade. And so now the issue goes back to the states. So whether or not you can easily access abortion care, and by the way, throw another footnote in here, there are so many other reproductive healthcare services that get performed at clinics where abortions are also performed, right?
Correct.
So throw that in there, right? But the reality is, it's now going to go back to the states. So you can easily expect 20, 25, 30 states potentially to rush, just like we saw with voting rights, right? When Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was eviscerated, and you started seeing all these new voter couch as voter rights legislations, right? You have all these new laws popping up all over the place. We can expect in legislative sessions soon to come to a theater near you, state near you, that I'm sorry, don't let me call out Alec. Don't let me act like this is a concerted strategy and plan, that there's already a playbook in the works, that there is an easy and ready-made template for state legislatures that would like to roll back abortion in their states. Don't let me just give one organization all the credit. I'm not going to do that. So that's where we find ourselves. We not. I mean, that's literally where we find ourselves, and the implications of it. I don't think we can even fully wrap our minds around at this point. what the implications of this are actually going to be, right? Because just because you take away someone's ability to have an abortion does not take away their need or their desire to have one. And so then what are the
fact
lengths?
that they will still
get one.
An abortion.
They will still have one. Guess, we're not going to get into the nitty gritty of how abortions used to be performed before there were safe medical procedures and clinics or pills that people could take, medication to help expedite that kind of thing. But it's, I will tell you, to be very honest, I am still baffled isn't the word. I'm exhausted. I am actually exhausted. And one of the things that this opinion has personally triggered for me is the reality and the very ever-present reminder that one of the key ways that racism and white supremacy and power maintain themselves is through just this onslaught that causes the people on the other side to be exhausted. And the reality is, yes, we have this new decision, but the battle has just begun. The battle has just begun, like in Clarence Thomas's opinion as part of this. So, Justice Samuel Alito was the lead author on this, and Justice Thomas had to throw his part in, but he already signaled. He's like, oh, by the way,
we coming for other rights.
Gay marriage may be on the table. The use of contraception, that could be on the table too. So, I mean, I just, there's almost too much to unpack to wrap my mind around. It is exhausting. I think the politics of this are that, yes, the agency and ability that people have to make decisions for their own bodies, right? In consultation with their family, with their doctors, with their higher power. If they, you know what I'm saying? That is obviously implicated in this. I think this decision, though, gives you a feel for the political moment that we are in, right? In this 6-3 court, 3 of the conservative justices, again, as we mentioned earlier, having been appointed, nominated by Donald Trump, zoomed through their confirmation.
Can we park right there real quick, Twin, though, on the politics point? Because I hope I don't care if I get myself in trouble, but I hope that, as I articulate this, I try to articulate this as best as possible. We need to acknowledge, and I'm going to take an angle that is not often publicly talked about. We need to acknowledge how we got to this 6-3 Supreme Court.
Yes.
We have said on this podcast that elections have consequences. Good and bad, elections have consequences. And I like that you used the term exhausted instead of shocked, because to be honest, most Black people, and especially Black women, were not shocked that this moment was coming. And I want to hearken, here's why I want to make this point politically. Forget how people do or don't feel on the choice of Hillary Clinton. The facts show, though,
her emails.
About 90% of Black women, when that election came up, voted for Hillary Clinton.
Indeed.
55% of white women who weren't only conservative, I'm going to say that again for the people in the back, who weren't only conservative, believed that Donald Trump deserved a chance. Because what's the worst that could happen? And then we had some of those not all, but some of those same women who voted for Donald Trump found themselves conveniently at the Women's March right before, the day before his inauguration, because, you know, quiet as it's kept, outrage in the streets is now lucrative depending on who you are, and there can be coin that got there. Never mind what the policy agenda might be, which is where power resides. So when we say what's the worst that can happen, we see, and we've had a presidency of Donald Trump that was rife with a whole bunch of hangups and hiccups and narcissism.
But they didn't anticipate
Roe
being on the line.
Was he got 3 Supreme Court picks. And those Supreme Court picks are life tenure. So when
and by the way, all of these new justices are in their 50s, like early 50s.
Correct. So when we get here and we want to say that this disproportionately affects women of color, it does, not in the necessarily way as women of color are the ones predominantly out having these abortions as responsibility. No. It comes towards the politics of it and how we talk about it, who we suppose is there, and who's going to bear the real impact. And when we talk about maternal morbidity, that Black and brown women are at the highest points of, and it's really due to the battling with systemic institutionalized racism. So now even bringing a life into this world is dangerous. Oh, but because of some of the sexism and racism that sits here, this is why we say elections have consequences. So it's, in one sense, we need to call out that this is not shocking to the ones that have been the most disproportionately impacted and disparately impacted by these things. And so in my question to the country, forget the Supreme Court, is when we're going to start listening to the multi-marginalized voices who were telling you when it was an inconvenient truth. And so then when we get here and we're outraged and we're like, who would have known that Roe v. Wade, 90% of Black women that voted and did their job. Because what this could lead to, and this is what I want to get ahead of, Twin, this leads to, in this upcoming election, yet again, them continuing to try to lay it at Black and brown voters' feet, as if the reason there has not been progress is because Black voters and brown voters ain't showing up. But in some ways, that's not only not true, but if it were true, could you blame us? Because every time we try to tell you ahead of time, y'all don't want to listen till you get smacked over the head with a 2x4. So we sitting in this uncomfortable moment, but I just want to say, for the record, who could have seen it coming? 90% of Black women in 2016 election.
But listen, the ones who voted for Trump, they didn't see it because they thought that he was a supporter of abortion care. He liked to grab women by the... I mean, that could have been seen as a euphemism for the act of abortion. He was like, oh, he wants to grab them by, you know. Right. So he understands our importance. I can support that kind of candidate. That's what happened. What happened. That's what it was. Simple misunderstanding. How would anybody have guessed that we would end up here?
So the politics of this leads us into the power of this. The politics of this has always been this fight of states' rights versus, federal intervention and federal control. I will remind us, as I often have in this podcast at the top, that when we talk about states' rights, we need to keep in mind that we had a whole civil war on states' rights to own Black people. So when we have this states' right conversation, at some point we must acknowledge that it does not always work out like we would like to imagine it so for multi-marginalized communities. So given that it has now been punted into this thing of states' rights, Twin, unpack for us, what is the policy side of this? The power, like what's happening?
I mean, not to sound like a broken record, right? But the policy side means that all of these states, your state legislators, now have the power to write or rewrite into history what your access to reproductive care is going to look like in your state, right? So the policy will emanate from the people. And what do we say again? What's that gateway drug? It's that election. Who is in office matters. And once they are in office, It matters what gets put on the paper. Like, we like to think that by the time we show up to elections, like that's the time where we're making a big decision. But the reality is, by the time something is on the ballot, by the time someone is on the ballot, most of the important decisions have already been made. You talk about the devils in the details in terms of how policies come together. It is usually a broad coalition of people who are working feverishly behind the scenes to orchestrate a specific piece of legislation. And again, Alec, sorry, I just, ooh.
You know, that Rona be trying, I'm glad this ain't Rona, but it's
hitting you. It's
tickle in the throat.
Something right in there, the tickle in your throat. You know, there are templates that are made, legislative templates that make it real easy for a broad scale agenda to be enacted across a multitude of states. And our primary check against that is rigorous and consistent engagement, right? So being able to figure out who are the people in your community that you need to team up with. Maybe you are that person in your community who helps orchestrate it, but make sure that y'all are in there while legislation is being crafted. Because by the time something gets passed, by the time the decision point comes, your interests have likely been legislated away already if you haven't been actively engaged in the conversation.
Funny thing, Twin, on the policy side, we ask who could have seen this coming and who is shocked. Funny thing, Republican state legislatures, because we have things called trigger laws. What are trigger laws? Glad you asked, Twin. Trigger laws are those things where, you know, they had already presupposed and imagined a world where Roe v. Wade could be overturned at the federal level. So they already had legislation ready prior to yesterday's overruling of Roe that would immediately, so Louisiana, yesterday when the overruling came of Roe v. Wade, that was one of those trigger laws. There are trigger laws already that have been put in place in 13 states. And within the next 30 days, we're talking about 13 to 20 states that have already had their stuff together to bring to bear at the state level a more oppressive regime on women's rights to access to healthcare.
And by the way, how could they imagine that Roe v. Wade could be overturned? Because that's what they've been working for the last 15 to 20 years. It is called a long game. For the longest time, Republicans have been very focused on having the compositions of the court change. Why? Because there's this constant back and forth, these so-called checks and balances as between the different branches of government. And so if something comes out legislatively that runs afoul of what you want your agenda to be, well, if you have a favorable court, which yes, they're supposed to be politically agnostic, absolutely. But the reality is, judges are people, and people have opinions. People also can interpret the same Constitution differently based on their lived experience, right? Like, you can interpret, that is literally what law is. Yes, there are laws. Oh, but these facts did not seem to apply to my client because these laws, this seems a little bit different. This circumstance is a little bit different. Let me draw a distinction. And then we get more laws. And then it's this continuing cycle. And so, like, when we talk about, you know, having the legislation already in place because they could anticipate a world where there was no Roe v. Wade, well, of course, if you have been working for 10, 15, 20 years to make sure Roe v. Wade was overturned, and you have done a darn good job of not only, we talk about court packing, not only ensuring that the Supreme Court has a conservative majority that is likely to be willing to overturn it, but think about how many federal courts across the country, I think, what was it, 100, I'm gonna mess up this number, so you might have to correct me, Twin. Was it like 187 new federal judges were appointed under Trump's term, not including?
It was around that number, yeah.
It was around that, like, not including the three Supreme Court justices.
Correct.
That he chose. And so, like, all of these things work together, and it is part of a long-term and concerted strategy, right? Which, again, I feel like a broken record sometimes, but like, when we talk about the policy implications that emanate from the politics of the moment and of these different issues, the reality is Our opportunity to influence change starts with the ballot box. It continues with our consistent and rigorous engagement in the process at all points, right? Democracy is only as effective as the people who are in office and the people who are there holding their elected officials accountable. It only works if you work it. So it's like you can't say you have a democracy when most people have opted out of the process, either voluntarily or unwittingly. And oh, by the way, when the rent is too damn high, inflation is off the chain, your wages haven't gone anywhere, healthcare is expensive, keep going, education is piss poor, who's going to think and who's going to feel like they have time to actually engage the civic and democratic process? It is by design. It is by design that we end up in situations like this.
And I think the last thing I say on the policy power side, right before we, as you've already outlined, the ways for influence, is you said something that's so key. They could have imagined this coming. Those conservative voices, they could imagine this world. And so they had already prepared 15 years before. I can't help but harken back to the earlier conversation we had in this podcast, in this episode, about voting rights. Mm-hmm. Because to me, I'm left wondering, was it hubris and arrogance or a lack of strategy when people saw Shelby County v. Holder come down in 2013, something that should have been a solid right for Black folks and access to the ballot box? You didn't foresee that with that sort of court, that was not a 6-3 where we are today, that with that sort of court, that we could not be here where they was going to drag y'all's rights when it comes to women's reproductive rights. So either you were arrogant to think that it would never happen, despite the number of Black and brown and multi-marginalized voices that were telling you all otherwise, or you did not have a strategy like apparently the other side did. Maybe it was both. Who would know? All I know is the policy side of this says, if we're going to keep doing all of this stuff out the guise of states' rights, then the influence side says, to your point, Twin, not just engaging on a consistent basis in elections, but at every level. Because I would make the argument that while a party could conceivably still have power without winning the House and the Senate, because every policy at the federal level is going to have to be implemented at the state level. And so what, in this case, factually, not being partisan, factually, Republicans have over time done a masterful job of retaining control in state legislatures. So that even when we had, remember that expansion of Medicaid that y'all was thinking about in North Carolina, it was like that comb over that never quite combed over, you know what I mean, Twin? Where it didn't matter that the federal government had incentivized in great way for Medicaid expansion, state legislatures that were of the opposite party, out of pure pettiness, was like, yeah, we'll pass. No, thank you. And so we have to be at the ballot box strategically at all levels of government. That from the local all the way to the federal and the presidency, whether in midterms or in general elections, we are staying consistent to what is your strategy and which candidates fit that build of your strategy.
Yes to everything you said. And there's also a third option, Twin. Third option is that they saw it coming. They weren't arrogant. It wasn't a lack of strategy. They just didn't care, because as long as they could stay in office long enough, pad their own pockets, secure their own future, get some nice things in the work for friends and family, whatever the case may be. Because some politicians don't enter the arena to be public servants. They look at politics as an opportunity to personally advance themselves.
What, twin? Don't tell me that's irrespective of party, too. Oh, no.
What? Yes. There is no monopoly on it. Could you even imagine? Could you
Self-preservation is one heck of a drug.
You know what, though? It'd be great if self-preservation really worked out to its logical ends. Like people get short-sighted. They stop. They stop. They get a little greedy. Maybe it's too power hungry. Maybe they start smelling themselves a bit too much, but they stop short of logic because self-preservation played out to the fullest extent really says, I'm not just going to make sure that I'm good. I'm going to make sure that other people around me are good, at least to a baseline level so that they're comfortable and they don't feel attacked and stepped on. Because if they're happy and preoccupied with their own lives, they really ain't going to pay attention to what I'm doing. Self-preservation played out to the fullest extent actually allows for everybody to be good and for the bad actors to go all the way ham. So people ain't being all the way logical because they don't play it out all the way. They get greedy and they get caught up and they get power hungry, and it causes them to want to retract other people's rights, retract other people's opportunities, retract what other people have. And what happens to every great civilization when the natives get restless? When people are really unhappy, when there's too many people on the wrong side of prosperity, right? That's when civilizations fall. But we a young country, we dumb. We like 200 and some years old. We don't know history. We don't understand what happened in every other great empire that had been thousands of years old. We don't know these things,
So I guess the influence of this says, since we know that the connective tissue between a vast majority of the Supreme Court rulings have been, and you should anticipate will be, the kickback to states' rights. And the problem with that is not just, and don't think that if you're in New York or if you're in these other spaces that this Roe v. Wade overruling means, I'm good. So sad about those in Mississippi. So sad about those in Texas. Wait for it. States are actively suing other states and other providers in other states. And just because we have a short-term memory, I'm gonna remind us that even prior to January 6th, we had last year or in 2020 election, you had, these states like Texas, Ken Paxton, the Attorney General, leading a charge to go ahead and sue other states about their own election processes. So the funny thing about states' rights is those who make that argument only want states' rights to be in control as much as it conveniences them.
Correct.
But states' rights for sure don't give the consistency, the continuity across states that marginalized and multi-marginalized people who weren't originally seen favorably in the Constitution can hold on to. We'll unpack in a later precedent on whether precedence in and of itself is even working for Black and Brown in this multi-racial and multi-marginalized society. But that was the crux with which the Supreme Court decided that they would go ahead and be froggy and leap. So, y'all get you a strategy, figure you out a strategy. And this is just Breon, they ain't even my twins, rhetoric, but this is my thought. We saw before Donald Trump, people saying, I don't have time to be engaged in civic engagement. And then afterwards, when it started after Donald Trump, it started to sink in that, oh, wait a minute, he's really trying to kill us. It's amazing how folks got on their grind. The 2020 election, we had unprecedented turnout in this country. So to me, the lesson that should be learned is not necessarily let's retract, but let's add a strategy and accountability between elections. But that can only start at its most efficient if you plug in strategically at the ballot box at every election and then make that work between elections. That's the influence. That's the leverage. That's how you overcome and use your power.
You are listening to Leverage, the podcast about power, politics, and influence. I'm Kristal Taylor.
And I'm Breon Wells.